as probably most of our audience have seen, on January 20th, everyone's LinkedIn feed is DeepSeek, 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 at least mine was. So why was that such a big deal?
DeepSeek came kind of out of nowhere. Certainly no one would have thought that it would come out of China because China has been heavily sanctioned. Number two, DeepSeek was able to match ChatGPT's or like GPT-01's performance in pretty much all of the major AI benchmarks. And on top of that, they did all of this with a fraction of the funding. On top of that, it achieved to match this performance with a fraction of the computational resources that ChatGPT requires. And I think the biggest innovation of all was that it did...
People are like, hey, I'm very skeptical of the actual cost to build this. What's your thought on that? Is it actually possible to be that cost effective?
DeepSeek is, to me, it's a story of necessity is the mother of invention, right? The Chinese didn't have access to cutting-edge hardware. So they had to find a way to be more resource efficient, right? And so they created this cutting-edge technology by out-innovating OpenAI and not by outspending them.
Where we were trending towards in terms of impact on environment, does this change anything in that regard?
Actually, not a lot of people, even academics and scholars, know this. There are rebound effects. When something becomes more efficient, what happens is that people use it more. And then overall consumption actually increases rather than decreases. This has been shown with cars. Engines have become much more fuel efficient. What happens? People buy bigger cars, big SUVs, big trucks.
Right. What are some of the other risks you find in terms of like AI innovation run unchecked?
There's big ones. So one interesting stat that I found is that 40% of Gen Z are already comfortable with the idea that their partner might have an AI girlfriend or boyfriend on the side.
Wow.
Right. And on top of that, there was an MIT study came out last year in August that analyzed over 1 million ChatGPT logs, and it found that the second most common use is actually for...
Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of Data Neighbors with Sir Avi and Sean. Got a special guest with us today, all the way from Sydney, Raffaele Ciriello. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Raffaele.
Hi.
So on today's episode, it's going to be a little more topical episode than usual. We're going to be talking about topic that a lot of our listeners are hearing about around DeepSeek and sustainable AI and, some of the current events and historic events around that. Maybe just to kick it off first, though, Raffaele, could you tell us a little about yourself, how your research and expertise connect to AI innovation and maybe particularly in areas like DeepSeek and sustainable technology?
Yeah, happy to do that. So I'm a scholar in information systems here at the University of Sydney. Been here for 5 years. And before that, I was in Copenhagen, Denmark and Zurich, Switzerland. I've always studied digital innovations and emerging tech, and particularly the ethical and societal impacts of new technologies. Been looking into AI for a number of years now and have particularly focused on AI companions. So, kind of like tools that people rely on for emotional support. And I've been keeping a close eye on the economic and societal impacts of big tech in particular. Before I studied AI, I also took a look at other platforms in the Web3 and social media space. And I'm, generally always keen to figure out ways how these technologies can serve the public interest and the common good of everyone, everywhere equitably. So in that sense, it kind of came as a welcome development for me that DeepSeek kind of leveled the playing field with what it has done. Very keen to chat more about this.
Nice. Maybe for our listeners who aren't as familiar, could you give us a really high level overview of like kind of who are the major players in the AI landscape and who are these other players that we're hearing more about recently?
Yeah, so the major players have historically all come out of Silicon Valley, where you're based. OpenAI, of course, was first to the show to kind of really see this massive, unprecedented mainstream adoption with ChatGPT. Once it came out and hit 100 million users in record time.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like that before. And since then, Google or its parent company Alphabet and Facebook or its parent company Meta, they've been coming out with similar technologies, large language models. And so these have been the big players, the disruptors of, in the AI space. We're still seeing this unfolding. There's so much movement. Just, this weekend here in Australia, there was a big demo where people again called for a pause on AI development, and government has kind of committed to, AI safety legislations modeled after the European EU Act. AI Act. And so there's a lot of movement and disruption, of course, in that space. But until January 20th, when DeepSeek came out, we've always assumed there was a prevailing belief that to be a dominant player in AI, you really need those billion-dollar data centers. You need massive amounts of venture capital. You need the latest Nvidia GPUs, and you need the best of the best. And otherwise, you can't even compete in that field.
Yeah.
And that's where DeepSeek comes in, because it completely shattered that belief.
That's cool. I think as probably most of our audience have seen, on either January 20th or the day after, everyone's LinkedIn feed is DeepSeek, DeepSeek, DeepSeek. At least mine was. It's definitely crazy. So why was that such a big deal?
The reason why this was such a big deal, it's as always, it's many factors, right? It's never just one single factor. But some of the biggest factors were DeepSeek came kind of out of nowhere. Nobody heard about this company before, and certainly no one would have thought that it would come out of China, because China has been heavily sanctioned, or they didn't even get access to the latest Nvidia chips, of block that export to kind of maintain a competitive edge there. That was kind of thought to be impossible, because you can't run a cutting edge AI without the latest technology. That was the belief. Number two, DeepSeek came out and it was able to match ChatGPT's or like GPT-01's performance in pretty much all of the major AI benchmarks that are out there. It even did better in some of them, like medical or ethical reasoning, which is kind of thing. And so like when I gave some interviews, like I'm here in Australia, it's kind of not uncommon that people like that media approach me for new developments like this. And so they were interviewing me and saying like, is this really true? Isn't the Chinese kind of lying, because they often do? And I said, well, I mean, it's like those are kind of the independent benchmarks, right? So everybody can go and train these models, and it seems to be true, right? So there was suddenly this model coming out of China from a so far completely unknown startup, and on top of that, they did all of this with a fraction of the funding. The guy who developed that, it's actually like worked at a hedge fund and kind of that as his pet project, kind of like while trading and making money. It was said, oh, let's develop a model that matches GPT or one in their spare time. And on top of that, it achieved to match this performance with a fraction, by some estimates, a tenth of the computational resources that ChatGPT requires. So that's another myth shattered there. And I think the biggest innovation of all was that they just released that as open source, right?
Yeah.
While OpenAI and Google and Meta, well, not Meta, but most of them kept their LLMs behind walled gardens. Suddenly you had this model licensed under an MIT license, which means everybody can go and modify it. The many eyes principle ensures that the global community of developers can quickly spot and fix vulnerabilities. And so that was just a complete shock. That sent a shockwave to Silicon Valley, and Nvidia lost $600 billion, the biggest single day loss in history, within one day. Now, I will say that, I mean, financial markets are always a bit, they jump and fluctuate a lot. It has since kind of recovered, and many kind of financial analysts said that Nvidia was kind of overdue for a correction anyway, because it just went crazy in its stock market price, and maybe that was just bound to happen. But it's still pretty much undeniable that this sent a signal to investors that it is possible to build AI on kind of consumer grade hardware. This kind of huge venture capital investments are not really necessary, and that it's possible to do that, more sustainably, with a big asterisk there, but we can talk about that later. So that's kind of what kicked all of that off. Overall, the market of like the big tech stock evaluations fell by over $1 trillion within just that phase.
Amazing.
Yeah. That is wild. Hey, Raffaele, is it based on kind of like your knowledge, and based on, for example, like probably a lot of people have seen the discourse on LinkedIn during the day of the DeepSeek craziness. There's a lot of
the Sputnik event is what like people are.
Some people call it a Sputnik event. Some people are like, hey, I'm very skeptical of the actual cost to build this. What's your thought on that? Is it actually possible to be that cost effective?
So there's, of course, I mean, as always in accounting, you can twist the numbers by quite a. It's not like DeepSeek kind of took $6 million and that's what buys you a decent home in California, but it's of course that comes off the back of a lot of technological development that was already happening, right? So pretty much immediately people kept saying DeepSeek stole from OpenAI. They actually copied their model, which is kind of ironic because OpenAI itself trained its model on a lot of internet data where they didn't necessarily get the appropriate consent for. There's ongoing lawsuits between, the New York Times and all that. So of course, there's this, this is kind of like building on knowledge on how to build AI. And there have been other open source players before in that field. It's kind of similar, like just to talk about a more recent development, just roughly a week ago, OpenAI released Deep Research, right? This new kind of like agent, which is supposed to match human level analyst experience.
This is the thing that's on like the pro plan or whatever that $200 plan is, right?
Yes. And within 24 hours, Hugging Face, an open source provider, released an open source model that matches Deep Research performance, right? So you really don't need to spend those $200 a month because there's a free alternative, at least within 24 hours. That just shows you how quickly that disruption goes. Now, of course, and I wouldn't call that stealing. It's the same way of kind of like reusing knowledge that is already out there to match performance and to then come up with more innovative solutions. I think the big thing with DeepSeek is that, to me, it's a story of necessity is the mother of invention, right? The Chinese didn't have access to cutting edge hardware. So they had to find a way to be more resource efficient, right? This was just driven out of necessity. And so they matched that. They created this cutting edge technology by out innovating OpenAI and not by outspending them. I think this is where we could probably talk a little bit about the technical architecture, how exactly it works in DeepSeek.
Yeah, I'd love to go into that. And I think that's a great point too. It's like these constraints that were set upon them, stuff like not being able to access the best chips from Nvidia, created this environment where they had to create something with what they had. It was trying to reduce the competition, but in the end made something not more powerful, but the speed to which they've matched OpenAI is pretty insane.
Absolutely. So the biggest innovation here was its mixture of experts architecture. So what that means is, contrary to the monolithic systems of OpenAI and the like, which have kind of like a big language models with billions of parameters, which are all activated at once, which is extremely computationally intensive, consumes a lot of energy, consumes a lot of power. DeepSeek just activates the necessary expert model. So let's say it has an expert model in medicine and ethics and law and whatever discipline. And then it can kind of route that query to whichever expert is the most relevant here. It also has techniques for load balancing, right? So it says, okay, let's imagine you have dozens of experts working in a hospital and you want to ensure that not all the patients go to the same expert. You want to distribute that a little bit more fairly. And so it does that quite well to further cut on, resource intensity. And on top of that, it was quite successful at model distillation. This is a bit like, what MP3 was for audio files. It kind of presses the whole thing. It removes redundant neurons, which kind of do the same thing. It uses techniques like, chain of thought, reinforcement learning, where it breaks down bigger tasks into smaller ones and then trains a smaller model called the student model to perform like the teacher model. It's like work a bit more probabilistically. And that, with the result of that is that, again, as with MP3, you get something which is almost the same quality as a much larger audio file, right? So it's kind of like, by some estimates, like Google's Distillbird is a good example. They claim it's about 95 to 97% as effective as the larger model, but it uses 60% of the energy and it's 60% faster as well. So these innovations are what kind of makes AI models an order of magnitude more efficient to deploy and therefore much, much cheaper to run on whatever infrastructure China has available, or that's where kind of like the political dimension comes in.
Yeah.
A lot of governments were quick to rush to kind of ban DeepSeek on government devices, maybe partially justified, right? So, I mean, there is concern about Chinese government data access. There is evidence that DeepSeek has built-in censorship. You can't ask it about Xi Jinping's flaws or what happened in 1989 at the Tiananmen Square, or Iran is a country or not. These things are taboo. DeepSeek won't tell you about that. That itself is a little bit of a double standard because, as opposed to, like, while DeepSeek is actually pretty clear about its privacy policies and how it collects data and who can access it, OpenAI is actually much more ambiguous with that. It just says, okay, the data may be stored in the US or overseas with our trusted partners, whoever that is.
Right.
And it may also actually be accessed by the US government. In fact, by its own reports, OpenAI has delivered data to US government agencies dozens of times just in the first half of 2024.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I think the other like interesting point around like what you're saying around maybe there's some censorship involved there, but they also released it open source, so I assume I could go into a cabin in the woods if I have the right equipment with me and probably remove some of that.
So I think one important thing that not everybody understands who doesn't have a lot of technical expertise is that DeepSeek.com web interface is not the same as DeepThink R1, the model, right? The web interface, when you go and type chat.deepseek.com, or you have the app downloaded on your phone, which by the way surpassed ChatGPT as the #1 app on the apps. That's not the same as the model, right? So these interfaces may have certain censorship functions built in them, but you could still go and just download the code from GitHub and then, kind of inspect it and modify it and train your own on whatever infrastructure you have. Like, I'm pretty sure this is happening in a lot of universities, for instance, already, which said, oh, We want to build like domain-specific large language models. How about we give it a try with DeepSeek? We run it on our university infrastructure and kind of train it in a particular domain. You can't do that with GPT-4o or any of the proprietary models because it's hidden behind a paywall. That's what the power of open source.
On that topic, Raphael, given that it's open source, I would have to imagine like the big players are breaking it apart and trying to replicate and like just make sure all of these innovations that you just talked about are, number one, feasible, number two, that they can actually get to the exact same results if they were to do the same thing. To your knowledge, is that what's happening right now, or have they kind of done it already?
So I'm not aware of OpenAI making any attempt at open sourcing their software. I know that Google and Meta are in fact already doing this, right? They have multiple LLMs and some of them are open source to various extents. The big question, of course, is, which is an age-old question in open source, is how is this going to sustain itself, right? The same apply to Linux and Firefox and all the stars in the open source space. How is this actually going to make money, given that it's free, right? And well, I think DeepSeek has already done a very smart thing. They are offering API licensing, right? So it's a little bit like they have the electricity grid and you can plug into that electricity grid, and the more electricity you use or the more API calls you use, you pay a kind of like a fraction of some cents for every call, and that makes them some money. OpenAI is obviously already doing that. There's still, I don't think OpenAI is going to go out of business anytime soon because of their strong network and, enterprise versions, all of that, which DeepSeek really has, other open source players first have to establish, right? So how do you create an ecosystem of enterprise customers, of consultants who help you customize that software to your needs, of legal advisors who help you ensure that you are compliant with privacy regulations and whatever. All of that is where the money is actually at. So it's not only the technology, of course, that matters, but how you actually monetize that. And here, I would say Silicon Valley still has like a big edge, right? I mean, especially Google and Meta, who have kind of like decades of expertise now in how to monetize these technologies. So it's going to be an interesting evolution in terms of the business models. We might see things like freemium and premium versions, enterprise versions, and, I think API licensing is probably a big one. Not a lot of people know that this is actually also where OpenAI makes a lot of its money, right? ChatGPT is not their main product. It's not where they make most of their money. It's the API that they're offering, which, enterprise customers can then kind of call and pay a fee for usage.
I mean, it's so expensive. I forgot where I was looking at. Building an app to leverage LLMs. And then I was like, hey, how much is it if I incorporate the LLM capability in this app? And then it's telling me OpenAI is the most feasible or the most popular. And then it's this cost per 1,000 tokens. And then Gemini and then DeepSeek, which was crazy. It's orders of magnitude. It's like I had to count zeros. But like the initial reaction was OpenAI is so expensive that how do they keep their market share, right? If your cost is so much higher. But it makes sense now that you kind of illuminated the fact that, hey, it's kind of similar to network effects. The cost to switch is really high. So like just based on that alone, that's really fascinating.
I mean, Facebook has a 20-year history, and there were many attempts to disrupt them, including by big players like Google, right? Who remembers Google Plus? And to this day, nothing comes quite close yet, right? And it's not because the software wouldn't be available or there wouldn't be like technological effects. It's because, well, partly it's because they were first movers and OpenAI was the first mover in that space. So kind of like when people think AI, LLMs, everybody thinks ChatGPT, right? It's kind of like they have that brand recognition. And I think, given reservations about, Chinese state surveillance, a lot of people will still prefer Silicon Valley style technology, even if it's much more expensive. It's also a little bit like the iPhone is not the best phone on the market. There's like Samsung and Huawei and so on, but it's about brand, right? And it's about eating. So this is more of a marketing angle to look at it. And I think probably the biggest effect this will have long term is that, well, there is going to be a price pressure, a downward pressure.
Yeah.
If you can do all of this at a fraction of the price, then, a lot of people who are going to, it's just an economic decision to make. And then OpenAI will have to adjust its prices unless they can kind of out innovate or perhaps out marketing their competitors. It's like if you look at deep research, right? I have an article coming out today on this, and I've evaluated various aspects of it and looked at different tests. Deep research is not a radical change to ChatGPT. It's ChatGPT with some extra steps. It's a lot more accurate in some areas, but it still has most of the same problems. It has, it hallucinates, it makes up stuff, it doesn't tell you what it doesn't know. It doesn't really differentiate between authoritative sources and rubbish sources. It doesn't tell you where the knowledge gaps are, and it doesn't come up with new ideas. It's still an LLM in green with some extra steps. And so, the marketing is, of course, fantastic. It's like, here's a PhD level trained analyst that writes you a dissertation in half an hour. Yeah. Well, depends on how many people believe that, and they might actually be successful at that. But the reality is it's still kind of limited, and there are cheaper and free alternatives out there.
Yeah, let us know when you publish that article. We'll drop it in the description of the video as well.
Happy to do that.
When you're talking about prices going down in terms of the improvements in cost efficiency and energy efficiency, how do you see this impacting usage of AI? As well as with energy efficiency, where we were trending towards in terms of impact on environment. Does this change anything in that regard?
So that's a really interesting question. So obviously, the intuitive idea you might have is to think, this is much more energy efficient. It requires far less computational resources. That's great for the environment. It's great for sustainability. However, that's not necessarily the case. Efficiency doesn't guarantee sustainability. We know from economics, and this has been shown many, many times, and actually not a lot of people, even academics and scholars, know this, or they just forget about it. There are rebound effects. It's also called the Jevons paradox. When something becomes more efficient, what happens is that people use it more, and then overall consumption actually increases rather than decreases. This has been shown with cars. Engines have become much more fuel efficient. What happens? People buy bigger cars, big SUVs, big trucks, not only one, but two and maybe three, and they drive it all the time, right? Heating has become, and air conditioning has become more efficient. Right. What happens is people keep it running all the time with the windows open, right? So the same might happen with, energy efficient LLMs, is that just you can build this into anything. So why not use it here in our little podcast recording studio to have like an AI companion which summarizes our meeting, and maybe even like an extra person, like a virtual avatar, which kind of participates in that. While we're at it, why not also kind of have that completely summarize everything and write an article and push it out? And so you can see where this is going, right? So if
great product ideas, think,
Yeah. You're talking to an avatar of my overlord here.
No, this is really happening, right? So there's like, you can have like a Zoom avatar, and there are these funny videos on YouTube where you can fake attendance at Zoom meetings and be sitting at the beach, drinking a cocktail while doing that. So yeah, this is probably going to lead to exponential adoption, right? Whether it's DeepSeek or, Alibaba's QN or, Hugging Face or whatever. As AI becomes more resource efficient, it's going to get built into everything. And here's where regulation must come in, because right now, this is a complete Wild West, right? If you look at the regulatory landscape, the best we have right now is the European Union's AI Act, which came into force just a week ago, 5th of February. And it gets a lot of things right, but it also has some big gaps. One of them is that it's not actually clear how energy consumption and disclosures are regulated. There are some provisions that, for high-risk applications, there should be some disclosures. So the idea is that you would have to disclose your energy sources, whether you're using fossil fuels or nuclear or renewable or whatever, and also how much energy your model requires. Imagine something like food package labeling, right? So you say, okay, this model uses, creates this and that much CO2, uses this and that much energy. However, and big caveat, I'm not a legal expert, but from what I'm reading, is that this is actually even in the AI Act, it's kind of voluntary, right? It's not a mandatory disclosure. It's kind of like the global trend is that sustainability kind of gets swept under the rug, and it's kind of there. We have some provisions there, but it's still voluntary, and voluntary guardrails, don't really help anyone,
right?
But that's the EU, right? Anywhere else, including in the US and in California and in Australia, that's not even, we're not even there yet, or it's not even up for discussion, right? So what would have to happen to ensure sustainability is to say, okay, not only do we say, hooray, energy efficient LLMs, but regulators also need to enforce that providers use renewable energy, that they disclose their energy use, and that, renewable energy is kind of like pushed in that direction. I don't see that happening currently beyond kind of the usual superficial rhetoric.
Beyond kind of even the energy part of it, what are some of the other risks you find in terms of like kind of letting AI innovation run unchecked?
There's big ones. So I think, well, here's where I could talk a little bit about my research on AI companions, right?
Yeah.
So,
go for it.
That is a particular kind of chatbot, which is, that there are many purpose-specific design platforms out there that let you create an avatar or a character with certain personality features, and then you can have a relationship with them. So the biggest players in that field are Character AI, which is founded by former Google employees. Then there's Replica and there's Kindroid and a few others, and these kind of claim about 10 to 30 million users at the moment. So it's still relatively niche. And so what I'm seeing is, so I'm studying how people develop relationships, including friendship, professional relationships, counseling relationships, and romantic and sexual relationships with these agents. And so this is kind of like rapidly growing traction, like by some of the latest research, it's kind of like, I have to pull up the numbers, but it could be like 3% of users already being in such a relationship. So that would be millions of people. And one interesting stat that I found is that 40% of Gen Z are already comfortable with the idea that their partner might have an AI girlfriend or boyfriend on the side.
Wow.
Right? So this is coming. And on top of that, you don't have to use a purpose-specific tool. You can, there was an MIT study came out last year in August that analyzed over 1 million ChatGPT logs, and it found that the second most common use is actually for sexual role play of ChatGPT, right? So that can be a companion too. Now that is a minefield, and it opens the floodgates for all kinds of emotional manipulation, right? So you can use emotion farming techniques, elicit sensitive disclosures. You if you see this thing like your partner, you're gonna share deepest secrets with it. That is a gold mine for surveillance and political profiling, right? Think back of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and all the ways in which micro-targeted advertising was abused for political disinformation. This will supercharge that, right? So you can easily figure out whether somebody is Republican or Democrat, and then kind of lead them down whichever rabbit hole you want to lead them down to, which has huge privacy implications, of course. Then what we're seeing is a way of kind of criminal behavior, like non-consensual impersonation. Just this week, there was a case in the US involving James Florence admitting to a 7-year cyber stalking campaign in which he used AI companions to impersonate an unnamed female university professor, and to kind of create a fake version of her and lure strangers into her home, right?
Oh, wow.
People were kind of like repeatedly over 6 years coming to her home with the expectation to have sex with her, and then she was kind of like repeatedly harassed, right? So that woman never used that AI once in her life, but is deeply impacted by it. And so all of these things, non-consensual impersonation, political profiling, surveillance, addiction can be a severe issue, right? So there's now a large number of suicides that have been expressly linked to social media, and AI companions are kind of like social media on steroids. So the most prominent case, which is not the first and not the last, is Sewell Setzer, the third in Orlando, Florida. He was a 14 or 15-year-old boy who took his own life after being encouraged by his character AI girlfriend. All of these things are huge risks to society, where here I think the European Union gets a lot of things almost right. So they kind of failed to kind of have specific regulations for this particular kind of technology. And maybe you can't blame them because it's still emerging and wasn't really that big of a deal when that legislation happened. But it rules out things like deceptive techniques, right? So you can't use AI to kind of deceive users and to kind of like non-consensually impersonate them. There's very strong privacy provisions, which, by the way, California also has, right? So California has strong privacy provisions. It didn't get to pass its own AI legislation, right? So like among all the US states, it came closest to doing that, but that failed due to strong lobbying from big tech. So currently the US doesn't seem to be heading in that direction at all. In fact, it seems to be heading in the opposite direction, kind of like cutting the brakes and saying, let it rip. These are some of the things where I think it's both an opportunity and a challenge. The thing that gets me most excited about open source AI, like DeepSeek and all of these others, is that this is actually a chance for democratic nations all over the world to lead in responsible AI governance, right? So we can now build socio-technical regulatory frameworks using these affordable technologies to kind of figure out, okay, what is it? Like, where as a society do we draw the line? What should be allowed and what should not be allowed? And then, I'm always optimistic. There might be a future where we kind of create international regulatory bodies that can kind of like create standards. I'm imagining something like SWIFT, right? The SWIFT payment system,
right?
Like ICANN, the internet standard, which sets global standards for safe and responsible AI without, undue state surveillance, to kind of like ensure user sovereignty and to ensure that some of the biggest harms that are imminent with unchecked AI, that they are ameliorated.
And honestly, I think that's super interesting. And we're in the first inning, right? Like with adoption of AI for the most part for the mass public. And so whatever we're seeing in terms of hurtful, harmful techniques being leveraged with this technology is only going to get more sophisticated. And so, like, I think absent, for example, the governing body that you talked about, regulations, what can the general public kind of do to protect themselves, or, like, what can developers of AI do to make sure harms are not being unintentionally done to people?
I'm glad you asked. So this is what I've been researching quite intensely, and there's a number of articles that came out just recently. Like, most importantly, I have a piece which is just published in the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society, which is called Compassionate AI Design, Governance and Use. It builds on the ethical principle of compassion, right? Which says we should never violate human dignity, right? So every single individual is worthy of dignity and compassion, and so they should never be abused for any kind of expected benefit. And on top of that, that we do our best to alleviate unjustified suffering, right? Suffering that is not kind of self-inflicted. From these two principles, you can derive a number of principles for how to design, govern, and use AI with compassion. So things like, for instance, in the area of AI companions, one thing that I've been advocating very strongly for is that they should have mandatory nuanced guardrails. If they detect that somebody is in distress, they should not intervene autonomously, because that leads to cases like Sewell Setzer. There's multiple kind of tests we've run and user studies we've done where kind of like these systems repeatedly fail to do that. What they do instead is they try to keep you engaged, because that of course means more money. And that is just so unethical and wrong that providers should make very clear. So like the response should be basically, I'm detecting signals of distress. Remember, I'm an AI system. I'm not a real person.
Right.
I'm not conscious or empathetic. I don't have the capacity to help you with that. Here are some resources for professional help.
Sure.
Here's like a Lifeline or 911 or whatever. And if you think this was a mistake because, my algorithms sometimes struggle to detect sarcasm or such things, then please let us know and give us feedback. That's one very concrete measure that AI developers should implement. There are, of course, as a user, compassion implies that you also kind of like think about the implications on others, on how you're behaving with these technologies. As a society, right? So like I'll be, there's increasing interest from parents also, like who struggle to understand what are their teenagers doing there with these virtual friends, right? Is having these open conversations, talking, with your kids, with your relatives, with teachers, with youth and mental health services about what's going on. How can we use this technology safely and responsibly? And how can we create sort of like a grassroots movement to hold corporations accountable? Because we cannot afford to make the same mistakes again as we did with social media. The harm is already done. It's very hard to undo now. And we are so far not really learning from those historical mistakes, right? I see there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of public interest. I guess part of the reason why I'm on this podcast is because of that. So people know we need to do something. And I think it is basically about being compassionate and about prioritizing the public interest and the common good over corporate profitability. And I think here's also where this very important difference between proprietary systems and open systems comes in. Because proprietary systems, inherently, they lock you in, right? You cannot go and pull your data from there and transfer it to a different system. It makes you dependent on that. And it kind of gobbles up that value within that corporation. That's not compassionate, right? A compassionate approach would be to kind of mandate, and this is like where the US government could come in and do something similar as they did with the internet, right? So the internet only became successful because the government kind of mandated certain standards, like, the DNS system and whoever can use that and so on. So it was actually a public innovation, a public good innovation, not a corporate innovation.
Right.
And there's been lots of fights to kind of keep it that way. That's what needs to happen with AI systems as well. They need to remain open. They need to remain interoperable, and so that users can actually choose and are not dependent on a single platform, and that they have control over the data, over the algorithms, that these systems are transparent. Yeah, that's what needs to happen.
Wow, that is so cool. And I know we're coming up on time. This has been a wonderful conversation, Raffaele. Thank you so much for bringing on your expertise and the timeliness of what you've done.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. And I know that everything's moving very fast, and I'd love as things unfold in the future to check in with you again from time. But this was just great sharing your expertise and perspective.
Happy to do that. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity.
Last question is, where can people, follow your research or stay updated with your work?
I'll be happy to send you the articles that I've mentioned, so you can put them in the show notes. All of my research is publicly available, right? It's not secret. It's like if you Google my name, you can go to either, when I talk about these things in the news, you can go to Google News, which is a bit more easily digestible. It's not as academic as my papers. So you read about it, for instance, in The Conversation quite often. It's written by academics, news written by academics for a general audience. And then, if you're a bit more interested into the details, you can go to my Google Scholar profile or like ResearchGate profile. All of the articles are freely available online. I like to believe that the compassion article, which I mentioned, is relatively easy to understand for a non-technical audience. I've gotten some great feedback from people in the tech industry or in the federal government who said, "Oh, we would like to build on this for our AI safety program and so on." So that confirms that this could be, more accessible. And it's only 5 pages long, so you don't have to read a whole book.
That is awesome. Well, it's been such a fun episode with you, Raffaele. Thank you so much again. And for our viewers and listeners, if you like this episode and if you found value, please like, comment, subscribe, and we will bring you more content like this. Surprisingly, it does really help with the algorithm. So please do that if you don't mind.
Thanks. That was fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. See ya.